Well, good afternoon, everybody. We might get started. My name's Selena Fisk. I'm a school data consultant, so I look after learning analytics and student wellbeing data in a whole host of different schools. And I'm here today, I'm based in Queensland, and I'm also joined by Deb Masters. I'm going to pass over to her in a sec so that she can introduce herself. For those of you who don't know me, I taught for 16 years in private state schools in Queensland, and I taught in the UK for a little while. And my journey with learning analytics and with data was that I was working on my thesis over the years from 2011 to 2017. And towards the end of 2017, I finished that off and I started my own small business. And I started that while I was teaching full time. So I've been a teacher up until the end of last year. And then this year I've gone into working in this space full time. And I'm really glad that you joined us this afternoon. The reason why these webinars came about is because the more work I've done with people in different schools around the country, the more people have said to me, I'd really love the opportunity to share and learn from other people and find out the challenges that they're facing, the strategies that they use, different kind of ideas from different people. Because often in schools, our sharing happens either within our school or within our network or system only, and there isn't a lot of, cross-border sharing or cross-system. So this is one of 3 webinars that I'm running through semester 2. I'm really glad you're here, and I'm hoping that there will be a lot of that sharing this afternoon. We do have people, particularly across up and down the East Coast. We've got people in Melbourne, regional Victoria, New South Wales, Canberra. We've got some people in Adelaide and Queensland. So thank you so much for joining us. And if you weren't aware, this is being recorded and it will be available to the other people, particularly who have signed up but couldn't make it this afternoon. They'll be able to watch it at the end. I might just pass over to Deb so that she can introduce herself too. Sorry, Deb, we can't hear you.
Rookie mistake. You'd think I would have done enough Zoom calls now to know to put my microphone on. I mean, I spend all day, every day on them, but there you go, I missed that. So thanks, Selena. Thank you for the invitation to be part of this. I'm a bit of a data geek, and a geek, not so much, a slightly different kind of geek to Selena, in that I like how the use of data is applied. I'm not suggesting Selena doesn't, but really like that big picture notion of how data is used, how it's used most effectively, system-wide, countrywide, and in schools. So that's my background. And when I saw Selena putting forward the notion of this group on LinkedIn, I said, yes, really love to be part of conversations about collaboration about data. So I'm currently working for Education Services Australia, based here in Melbourne, and I'm part of a very large federal project where we're looking at building an online formative assessment ecosystem. And I can talk to you about that a little bit too if you're interested. So that's me.
That's awesome. Thank you, Deb, and thanks for joining us. I'm just going to share my screen now. One of the things, if you're, I know there's some people driving this afternoon, but if you're on a computer and you're able to, it'd be really great if you could just introduce yourself in the chat box on the side. Just maybe say, introduce your name, just where you're at, and maybe what role you're in, because as well as having people from really different geographical areas, we've also got people in really different roles in schools. Okay, so our plan for this afternoon is split into these sections here. So first of all, Deb's going to start us off, and she's going to talk about some of that bigger picture stuff around the importance of evidence and being evidence informed and using data in schools to ultimately improve the outcomes for young people. I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about some of the challenges that I see in my work in working with different schools and systems around the country. We're going to throw back to you and ask you kind of what the challenges are in your context and what you face. And then as we asked you when you registered, there were quite a few people who submitted some questions for us, and we're going to have a go at answering those and then open up to a broader Q&A towards the end. So we might get going. So Deb, I will pass over to you again.
Oh, thank you. Thanks again. And when Selena and I were discussing this last week, I looked at the questions that you had posed, and I thought they actually really naturally fit into that picture of really big questions, big system-wide questions, and then you've got a lot of very specific questions and wonderings as well about the best tools to use, when to use them, and all of those good things. And I think I was really struck as well by the wide range of people that were coming to this session, and it's always really challenging when you have people from such varied backgrounds and in particular roles, to know what is going to be the most interesting thing for them to hear, what will be the takeaways and the things that you take away from a session like this. So that's why Selena and I kind of tried to pitch it that I would give a kind of a big picture, and Selena would go into some of the detail. And I have to say too, look, if there's anything that I mentioned today in terms of a resource, you think, oh, I'd really like to know a little bit more about that, just reach out. I know my email address is at the end of this presentation. And I guess just for those of you who would like to know a little bit more about me and my background, I have been a primary and secondary school teacher, and you will have judged by now probably that I'm from New Zealand, for those of you who've got keen ears, and I know a lot of you know me who are online anyway, and know I'm a Kiwi. But I have been based in Australia here in Melbourne for over 3 years now, and have done a lot of work in Australia in the lead up to that as well. But as a primary and secondary teacher, then I went to work in the New Zealand Ministry of Education, and in that role I managed assessment policy, assessment professional learning, the development of assessment tools, a nationwide assessment tool in New Zealand. Then I went to work at the University of Auckland with Professor John Hattie, and did a lot of work with him developing what is now an international framework for evidence-based teaching and learning in schools. So I helped John to develop the Visible Learning Program, and that many of you will know something about, well, if not the well, certainly the research, if not the professional learning model. So I guess I use that as a background because it's really important to some of the really bigger questions, which is, you know, having seen that really big picture, and having worked with education systems and then worked with schools, and I kind of cross those boundaries constantly in my work. It's really looking at, you know, it would be lovely to come along to a session like this and say, if only you use this tool, this would be the one that would really solve all of your problems. Hey, presto, here it is. And of course, there's nothing like that out there. Although I know Sandy Heldsinger is on the call, and she would probably say Brightpath probably does just about everything, wouldn't you, Sandy? But I'm just having fun at Sandy because I know she's there. But I know that there is no one, you know, there's no one tool or one system to, hi Sandy, to rule them all. So, you know, when I'm working with education systems or with schools directly, it's really looking at what are you trying to accomplish? What is your big picture goal? What do you want to achieve by collecting assessment data or evidence of any sort? What do you want to do with it? What are the changes you might want to introduce? And then I think the other big thing that's really important is, how do you actually check into the motivations of the teachers that you're working with? Do you actually explore what their beliefs are? I've been working with a school here in Melbourne for a couple of years now, and it's been really important in this work I've been doing with the leadership team to say, get to know what your teachers' motivations are. You need to really be bringing them into those discussions. And I know Viviane Robinson and the work she does very much talks about that, actually really exploring people's beliefs and understanding what their beliefs are. So what are the things you want to introduce and why? And then how, and the big thing is, how will you know that the change you make is actually an improvement? I was talking to a friend of mine who's principal of a school this morning, a very large primary school, and she has been in that school for about 9 or 10 years now, and she has made a lot of changes in the time that she was there, in the time that she's there. She's just announced that she's leaving actually, so that's one of the reasons we're having a chat. But the big thing that Julie does is really track the impact of all of the improvements and all of the initiatives that she puts in place. And it's not a hard thing to do. People kind of think that developing tools to measure changes along an impact cycle is hard, but it's not a difficult thing to do, because you do need to know that any change you make is going to actually make an improvement. So It's really having those really big questions in your head. You know, there's one of the questions that's come through this morning for this workshop today, or this webinar, is, you know, how do you make a system-wide change? Well, what is the change you're wanting to make, and what is the evidence upon which you say you're wanting to make that change? When I came to Melbourne, I worked with the Catholic Education Melbourne system. I know of a lot of my colleagues from there from a couple of years ago online today as well, and it's asking those really big questions. So what is it you're looking at doing? Why are you wanting to do that? There's Jane is just talking to us. I know Janine's online as well. We go to the next slide. I'm not going to talk for too long because I know you want to get, because look at all this stuff. Look at all the stuff that's out there. And I just put all of these on here just as an example. We know these tools. You know, we've worked with a lot of this research. We know this stuff. And the real challenge for us when we look at this stuff in terms of change, in terms of whether it's about assessment, whether it's about teaching and learning, whether it's about student-centered learning, whatever it's about, positive behaviour for learning, what evidence are we using to say that this is what we're going to actually base our change on? So there's all of the information out there. If we go to the next slide, Selena, because then we can go to, it's a one-size-fits-one. It's not saying here's a system, here's a program, here's a set of tools. It's about us thinking about interpreting that information. And people like Selena or myself or your colleagues or people like you who are on the call, supporting your colleagues to make those changes. So that's why I think I got so excited about the group that Selena was talking about pulling together, because I would really like to see this as the beginning of a lot of ongoing conversations about, we've tried this didn't work, what about this, how might this work, how can we collect evidence about that, because none of us has got a magic wand. And the next slide, really, you know, and going back to the tools that we know, I love a lot of the AITSL material and this performance and development framework, and building that culture of performance and development is really important, and using those as guides for us as well to guide your school development, whether you're working with schools. I know different systems have got different tools that they tend to use, but it's finding the tools that are really valuable for you. And certainly people like us, all of us, supporting each other to find those. And then I think the next slide, and I'm not going to go into it, you know these things, and then it's actually looking at that new learning in action. You know, I spend a lot of my time reading and trying to make sense of and trying to develop frameworks out of the reading that I do for the purpose for which I might be asked to do that. So at the moment, as I mentioned earlier, I'm part of a nationwide project at the moment where we're working with AITSL and ACARA in every state and territory, every jurisdiction, to develop an online formative assessment ecosystem. And what we've done there is we've gone out to teachers, school leaders, people in ministry, Department of Education officers across Australia, and we've said, what are the biggest barriers you have to effective use of data for formative purposes in your teaching and learning? What are the biggest challenges you've got? And then we've come up with a set of hypotheses and are developing a prototype of a tool that's not going to be the magic tool. It's going to be pretty fantastic, but it's not going to be the magic tool to fix everybody's problems. But it'd be no surprise to you the things that teachers are saying to us. You know, it's about us having systems and processes in our schools to have all our discussions alive. It's about us having easy access and ready access to data and information about students. It's about us knowing what to do with that information when we get it, because we've got plenty. And it's about streamlining the systems and the processes. So that's why in this particular project, we're looking at teachers being able to use the tools that they use, the tools that they love and use and they've loved and used for ages, and to be able to pull all of that data and information into one ecosystem, so then it can report student achievement. But this is in the National Literacy and Numeracy Learning Progressions, and report student achievement on a common kind of a dashboard, but then also linked to, so if you've got a student who's at this particular level in the learning progressions, this is a resource that might help. So we're building in a suggestion engine that will take some of that, because teachers are saying time is our big challenge. So how can we take away some of the challenge for teachers of having to sift through whole lots of resources, so when they get that information, that it's easy for them to interpret and then to action, because we are supporting them with resources that they might choose to use. So it's not taking anything away from the teachers, it's actually saying, teachers, here's some resources you might actually assign to kids as well. So it's always a fine balance to walk in a project like that, because you don't want to add to the burden for teachers, you want to actually make things streamlined. But just in kind of wrapping that up, I'll come back to a comment that Selena made, was that this is an opportunity to be able to talk across jurisdictions, states and territories about the challenges you face, and the opportunities as well. Because one of the things that we heard loud and clear and continue to hear, we have actually, as part of this project I'm involved in, we have convened a teacher practice reference group. AITSL have convened that, and it's representative of all schools across all states and territories and across Australia. And the big thing that they were saying in their meetings was, as they were talking to each other as colleagues, you know, when I've moved from Sydney to Darwin, why don't I still have access to that information? Why is it that this is closed off to me? Gosh, you're doing great stuff there. I want to know about this. How can we actually share? So even though they've been helping us to conceptualise what this ecosystem might be like, they're actually really learning about what is really effective practice in other places. And that's why this is so exciting. So it's kind of a big picture framing, but you know, I'm all behind us having conversations and really trying to brainstorm and work out some of these gnarly problems together. And I'll throw back to you, Selena. I think that yes, see, good timing.
Perfect timing. Thank you so much, Deb. It's really great hearing you speak. And I hope that for everybody here, it's quite reassuring to have somebody working at that level where I guess your priority is teachers and making teachers' life that bit easier, being able to put information in front of teachers. And as you said, so they're not having to trawl through all different sources and different places to try and find it. So I'm really grateful that you're doing that work, and I'm really glad that you're I'm really excited about what the National Formative Assessment ecosystem, as you keep referring to it, is going to look like. And I also love that you don't keep just calling it a tool, because as you say, it's just one part of a bigger picture. There's never just a one-size-fits-all model for every school, and I think you've captured that really beautifully.
I think just if I can, before you move on, Selena, we're going out at the moment in the next couple of weeks to test the prototype. So this particular ecosystem has been co-designed with teachers and school leaders from around Australia really deeply. We've been out, and some of you may have been involved in some of the conversations that we've had already. But in the next couple of weeks, we're taking the prototype out, and we're actually testing the prototype in a whole series of moderated sessions. If anybody's interested in being part of the testing for the prototype, you just have to go to the website. And Selena, we might actually put that on the last slide as well, the website, and you can just sign up to be part of the user testing for the ecosystem, where you say, yes, that's really useful, that's rubbish, take it away, that will just be a distraction. So you can help to shape the ecosystem, but also the professional learning that AITSL is actually looking at for formative assessment and the ecosystem as a whole. So please, we'd love you to be involved.
That's awesome. Thank you. I'm working in one school a couple of days a week as a consultant, and I've signed them up for it, and I can't wait. I mean, I'm a nerd, but I'm really excited to see what that first version looks like. So yeah, really sign up. But we can get that link as well and share it with you.
No, we'd love you to come on and to be part of our user testing. Be fantastic. And you're just, you know, I mean, perfect audience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, so we might just kind of change gears a little bit and talk about some of the practical challenges that I see in schools that I work with. I really like, again, that Deb also highlighted the opportunities that are out there, because while we are talking about the challenges today, there are so many great things that are happening in schools, and there's so much, there's individuals, there's teams, there's schools that are improving by using evidence to inform their practice and shift their pedagogy. And I don't want to take away from that, but at the same time, there are some real challenges around using data and evidence well in schools. And there's a few different reasons for that. I'm not going to go too much into the reasons today. I'm going to talk through some of these challenges. Now, the first one I see regularly is the teacher leader perception, or leaders impacting the way that data is used in schools. So from a teacher perspective, if a teacher has never seen data and evidence used well in a classroom or by other teachers, and all they see is my school comparisons, and in Queensland, Courier Mail lists of schools ranked from top to bottom, I think it's really natural that they would be quite fearful and quite worried about what that data and evidence might say about them, and then how it might be used. So I think that's kind of one of the inhibiting factors in schools. And I often work with like almost like a guiding coalition of people that are really active in the data space. And that's you guys, the people who come to things like this on a Wednesday afternoon. But the real challenge is actually shifting the other people who don't come to things like this and don't see the value in it. And that's sometimes, I guess, it is that historical context for them. For some teachers, they've also never been through any actual formal training in using data or analysing data. We know that university courses now are catching up, and a lot of our undergrads and our master's students are doing data analytics subjects at unis. But there's only a couple of years worth of graduates in our systems that have that experience. And at the same time, in some cases, the experience can be quite challenging because of access to school data and privacy and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of factors that impact a teacher's perceptions of using data, and that's a huge hurdle. I would say in terms of any change leadership, you know, if you're leading a group of people, it is work with those first adopters first, and then kind of have them go and share your message. The other one's leaders. If a leader in your school doesn't prioritize or see the value in using data or spending time at department meetings or staff meetings, thinking about what areas in the school are going well and what areas aren't kind of going so well and what can we do about that, then the message that they're sending to their teachers is that it's not important and that it shouldn't be a priority. Now, that doesn't stop the individual teachers going away and doing amazing things, but it's going to be far more effective if the whole team and the whole teaching staff are working together on kind of similar goals and working in a similar direction. Second challenge I see, and it's kind of linked to that perception thing, is around being data informed versus data driven. And I always make this distinction in any of my presentations, that this is always about being data informed. Teachers didn't get into teaching to track kids and reduce them to numbers. And I think if we as teachers, middle leaders, senior leaders, system leaders, approach any data conversation as we are using data to inform our practice with our understanding of individual students, of context, of teachers, I think we start the conversation in a far better place. I've seen leaders and worked with leaders that have said, you know, we're going to be tracked. We're doing this because the system is tracking us, or we have to report this information to them at the end. You're immediately going to get some of those people offside if that's the way that you start the conversation. So being really, I guess, hope-filled and optimistic and positive about this is actually about kids. This is actually about looking at the information we get about what they need, and then we actually adjust our practice and cater for their needs that little bit better. Another challenge that I see occasionally is that some schools or teachers don't always triangulate information. And if you've been to any of my webinars through the Teacher Learning Network, you'd know that I talk about this quite a lot. Triangulation is using 3 or more data sets to make an informed decision or to identify trends. Now, it's got its roots in research and in navigation originally. It's just as applicable in schools. And I'll use the example of if a school, for example, just looked at NAPLAN writing results and made significant financial investments and changes into resources based on just one set of data. Now, that information might be really useful and it might provide some really great insights. It could be accurate, but it also may not be all that accurate. So by collecting a second and a third data source, you're pulling in information from different areas of the school, still to do with writing, but you're forming a fuller picture and you're confirming those trends that you might see in the first one. So yeah, I guess just to summarize that one really quickly, because I'm running out of time, but it's drawing on a couple of data sources before you're making significant decisions about resourcing and that sort of thing. Another one is, again, I often talk about these 3 key components of using data well in schools. And the first one is data literacy, which is literally just understanding what the numbers mean and what they don't mean, what they tell us, what the limitations are. I work with people at all different levels in schools, and it's on one hand scary, but I'm also glad that I'm able to do it. That I have principals come to me and say, thank you for explaining NAPLAN bands. I wasn't 100% sure, but I've never been comfortable enough to ask people to explain it to me. And I think that's the reality that we're kind of in. We've got people on really different, on a spectrum of data literacy. We've got people at one end all the way through to people that have really high-end statistical level understanding and application of data in their school. But once you get out of the data literacy space, you get into the data visualization. And one of the things that Deb mentioned before was that the National Formative Assessment ecosystem is going to hopefully draw information from multiple sources and bring things together in a way that makes the teacher's job a little bit easier. That's one of the challenges I see. A lot of schools don't necessarily have a visualization platform that supports that, or they have a visualization platform where a teacher would still have to go to multiple pages and multiple screens to find out information on their class or on individual students. So, I mean, interpreting the visualization is another whole issue, but that's the second kind of stage that we get to. And then from that, those two are actually the least important, dare I say it. The data storytelling is actually the most important. And that's where we look at the trends and the information and work out what the data is telling us. And we think, okay, what are the stories in that? What does that young person need me to do for them to help them improve their vocab or their sentence structure? What does that small group in my class need me to do to improve their geometrical reasoning? You know, how am I differentiating my classes? The power in using data is in that storytelling and the action that takes place in a classroom as a result of understanding the data and having a visualization that gives you trends. But unfortunately, the time that people spend in this in schools is often limited to the data literacy and the data visualization conversation. So that's my third one. So again, same with data walls. And one of the questions that we got today is about data walls. I often see people with great data walls in schools and the data walls don't get used. They're set up, people, they invest a lot of time and effort. They look beautiful. They're set up at the beginning of the year. And look, there's people out there using them really well. I am generalizing, but there's some that stay and are not used in the way that they should be. It's all about what does it tell us, and then how do we actually act for our young people to make a difference for them. One of the other things that comes up regularly, and I think is emerging more and more in the conversation about using data in schools and learning analytics, is the difference between tracking progress and tracking achievement. And again, this is something that I'm really passionate about, because I think we do achievement really quite well. We have a top-down university entrance system. We celebrate our highest achievers. We have ducks of schools. We have, academic prizes. But we all know that there are some students that won't ever get to that point where they're receiving one of those awards, yet they may have worked really hard in English to get out of that C category into a B- category. And that progress that they've made deserves to be celebrated in the same way as the achievement of the students who are getting A's is. And I think that's a real challenge for us. And in the second Gonski report that came out, progress was spoken about a lot. And I don't think it's something that we're doing all that well generally. Again, there's big generalizations and on the whole, but I think that's an area that we could focus on. The last one I'll talk about is just the time that it takes. Some industry research recently that I was reading said that of the time it takes from collecting data to actually implementation of an action, 80% of that time is wasted or is taken up getting that data into a format that it can actually be used to ascertain the trends. So in that data literacy, visualization, storytelling kind of flow, 80% of the time is in the literacy and the visualization, getting it to a point where we can actually sit down as a group and go, okay, well, what are we even going to do about this? That's a massive challenge. It takes time. They're new skills, like any new skill. It's not something that, so I often run professional learning sessions in schools where I go in and I talk through the data literacy and the data visualization. That's not a one-off thing that I can just come in for 2 hours. I can tell people how to do all of this stuff, and then they can magically just do it and know when to do it and how to do it for the rest of their career. It's actually pretty challenging for people that are just beginning, and they do need a significant amount of time and resource investment to support them. The other challenge is professional learning. There are so many competing priorities with professional learning. You know, they're all important for different reasons. But if this is something that we're serious about, I think schools, leaders, middle leaders have to really start prioritising professional learning in this space. Deb, did you want to add anything at the end of that, or would you like to move on to the sharing?
I just think to come back to some of the points you made are just so incredibly relevant, Selena, and they are things that we have taken on board so much and listened to across Australia in terms of the ecosystem that we are looking at. And one of them is around progress. In fact, I just had a 2-hour conversation with a colleague today around some of the aspects of progress and achievement and how we are doing the data visualizations for them within the ecosystem, and what that's going to mean. And, you know, which do you prioritize? Do you prioritize the notion of people being able to understand the visualizations of progress and or achievement, and what does that look like? So it's really incredibly important. So I agree entirely. A lot of those challenges are things that we have certainly addressed. The data visualizations is one thing. What is the story that it's telling you? And, you know, it hooks into many of the questions that are coming up as well.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you. I'm just going to pause now for a couple of minutes and stop sharing my screen. But what I'd like you to do is have a think about what challenges you experience in your role or in your school, no matter where you are. Is there anything that Deb or I have mentioned that kind of resonates, or something that you've seen, or is there something that we haven't mentioned yet that you find is a bit of a challenge where you are? I might pause and give you about 4 minutes or so to type that into the chat box. I feel like we need some lift music or something. There's some really great contributions there. If you're typing at the moment, please continue. We will read them. Yep, Mitchell time. I'll address a couple of points then. I might go to Deb to make a couple of comments as well. I guess the comments about where to start with data when you have so much. I guess the first thing, if you are really new to this and weren't sure where to start, would be I would suggest a full analysis of all of the data that you've got. Now, that becomes pretty hard when you've got a lot of different information, potentially from multiple schools or from multiple departments, depending on what your role is. If you've got an idea though, which I'm assuming that you would, of a particular area that maybe needs some focus, then I would try and zero in on information that tells you about the performance or whatever it might be in that area. So one of the challenges, and I have never worked with a school that says, I don't have enough data, can you help me find some more? But it's about narrowing and cutting out some of that extra noise to really kind of get down to, well, if I want to know about how numeracy is going in my school, what are the sources of numeracy data that I have, and how can I start that conversation and start to analyze it? In the same way, if you want to look at well-being of students, you could say, okay, well, what are the types of information I need for that? I might look at behaviour reports. I might look at, say, bullying surveys or student well-being surveys. I might look at behaviour reports, attendance, that sort of stuff. But I'm narrowing the focus. I think you can only do that when you've got a bit of an idea about a particular area that maybe needs investigation. I know somebody made a comment about RE, and that is quite hard. One of the ways that people use data a lot is triangulating NAPLAN, PAT, and subject-based results, and that's really hard for subjects that that are not maths or English, because there isn't necessarily a straight kind of line of sight between one data source and that subject area, so that can be really tough. And the other comment I'll make is one about the silos, that there's often a lot of data sitting in department or heads of department or heads of year laptops, whatever it might be. That's a real challenge in a lot of schools that I work in. And I think part of addressing that challenge partly is coming up with a data storage system. So that might be having a product or a learning management system, a visualization platform where that information must be stored. Otherwise it does just get locked down. I was working with one school last year where teachers throughout the primary school didn't get access to NAPLAN data on individual students. They only got a year level summary, and that was it. And there were teachers saying to me, we really want to see what these students, where their strengths and weaknesses are and which students perform better than others, and they weren't being given that information. And I think it's got to be shared in a responsible manner, and there's got to be some parameters around how that's used. But yeah, the more you can get it onto some central platform where people can actually access it, the better. Deb, I might throw to you.
Yeah, I think just following on from that, Selena, I think when we went and did our user research in dozens and dozens of schools across Australia last year, we were asking those very questions. What are the systems that you are using for recording? What tools are you using? What systems are you using for recording? How you're storing it? I was absolutely gobsmacked at how much of it was still done on paper, actually. And they just had folders and folders and folders and boxes of whole lots of different stuff. And that was one of the pain points, or one of the frustrations that teachers had, was that they had no real streamlined systems. And of course, other schools have got amazing kind of systems as well. I guess one of the places that I really start is, it would be no surprise to you that I'm kind of a really big picture. Let's get the big framework, and then let's really zero in on the detail. And a couple of things that I've worked really hard to develop, and I'm really happy to send to anybody some system and school capability matrices. So looking at the evidence, so I told you that I really like looking at the research and the evidence and then pulling that out and trying to make sense of it, and have developed a couple of different matrices really. The key components for what an effective system would look like if they were using evidence in a really, really great way, and the same for a school. And, you know, if anybody, and then what I do is, or what you would do in your schools or with your schools or in your systems, is look at that matrix, collect a whole lot of the evidence. So Selena's talking about the specific evidence that, you know, that you might be using for teaching and learning. Let's actually shake it all out. Let's get it all out on the table and find out what existing practice actually is, not just with a collection of data and evidence, but in whole lots of aspects of having a really effective school. And then once you've got all that information, it's kind of, okay, us collaboratively talking about, so what, now what do we do with that information, and being pretty strategic. One of the key things that I know certainly John Hattie and his colleagues are really working on with their work internationally at the moment is about implementation. We have the information, but the implementation of any strategy, any new initiative is where it all falls down. Having really effective implementation strategies is really important. And a few years ago, I was working with Sir Michael Barber, who works out of the UK, and worked on in Tony Blair's government actually in making policy actually track through to practice. And the key thing that he talks about is actually setting up systems and processes and making them stick. Now that sounds easy, but actually that's the hardest thing of all to do. We have these wonderful ideas and then they don't stick. Why don't they stick? You know, and what would make it stick in a school or in a classroom? What is it that would help that? And for different people, it's different things. It might be a group like this might actually help to make some things stick, or to implement things with fidelity or consistently. It might be a colleague, it might be the way you set up systems in schools, but it's different. One size fits one. Well, actually, probably there's probably, you know, the commonalities, but, you know, it's getting that right. But, you know, really happy to send through those matrices, and if they're of any value, and tear them apart, you know, go crazy with them. But I can tell you the research that they're based on as well, if you're interested in that, and use them as a starting point. Get everything together, get it all on the table, have a look at it, and then strategize.
That's brilliant. What we might... Sorry, did somebody have a question? No, all good. What we might do is, after this, I was going to send out an email with a bit of a feedback survey with the PowerPoint, and Deb, if you don't mind, I might pop that into that email if that's okay, and get those to everybody. And that'll also have the link to the recording of this session as well, if you'd like to share it. All right, no, I'm not, because I pressed the wrong button. Okay, so I'm just going to go back to my PowerPoint, and we're just going to talk quickly through a couple of the questions that we had submitted to us before this webinar. We talked around a few of these things already, so we might go through some of them pretty quickly. But, you know, as Deb said, and I'm more than happy to have this conversation offline and after this. Our contact details are both at the end, so if you'd like to reach out and have a chat about any of it, or if you've got any questions, feel free to let us know. So Kate mentioned the lack of time, or had a question around the lack of time, and we've talked about that. But as I said, I think if it's a priority in your school, and if as a senior or a middle leader, you want people in your team to start doing this, it's about carving out time in your week to actually provide time for teachers to work with the data and to explore. Because it's a skill that we're building, I don't think it's as simple as just, okay, go away and work with the data. Okay, that's done, check the box, and then we move on to the next topic. It is something that we need to allocate time for people to sit around and just say, hey, this is what I noticed. What do you think this means? Or is there something that I've missed in this information? Those conversations actually really upskill others in the room that may not be confident enough to ask the questions or to start their own analysis. And I think it's really important that we can build time. Now, that could be in timetabling, it could be in department meetings, staff meetings, whatever it might be. But unfortunately, it's going to take time and money to do that. Chris asked some questions around 21st century skills and general capabilities, and I might just flick to Deb to answer that one.
Yeah, I mean, I've got no magic answer here either, but there are some resources out there that you might find quite useful. I was talking yesterday, critical and creative thinking has been a stream of work that's been happening in the project that I've been working on. And so ACARA have been looking at various ways that we might assess critical and creative thinking. And I know Sandy Housinger of Bright Path has been thinking about that as well. But I mean, the big question really around assessing general capabilities is, before you think about assessing, what are you actually doing in your school to be purposeful about actually introducing them, being mindful of them in lessons? How are you actually introducing general capabilities in teaching and learning? And that would be one of probably the key messages that I had from Danielle Kavanagh from ACARA yesterday when I chatted to her about this, because I was interested to know where their thinking had got to. And so that would be the first thing. And then there are some interesting resources, and I can send you the links. BCAA here in Melbourne have got some resources and some exemplars, I guess, of different tasks and different assessment tasks that you can do as well. Those of you who are from Melbourne will probably know them, but they have done probably some of the most detailed thinking around assessment. It's really magic. It's about how you're setting up situations for kids to actually be able to do critical thinking or whatever the general capability might be, and then how are you tracking the information from that. Seen through that link, a lot of that information is sitting on their website. And then I'm not sure if you had a look on the ACARA website too. Rooty Hills in high school in Sydney have actually got some really interesting videos, case study videos sitting on the ACARA website around the work that they've done, mainly in critical and creative thinking again. But I mean, I guess the first thing is, what are you doing purposefully to teach those general capabilities? What would you be expecting to see as a task that, or how is that embedded in current kind of teaching and learning practice or activities in your classroom? What would you be expecting to track? Now, I was doing this back in 2005 when I was managing assessment review in New Zealand, and we were thinking about key competencies, they're called in New Zealand. And I was in charge of assessment for key competencies, bless my cotton socks. And really, it was about thinking about how you actually, as I've said, how you're actually implementing it, what you're doing purposefully to introduce it as a concept in your school, and then how are you just documenting it, rather than assessing it, how are you documenting the shifts that you're seeing? So there are some examples out there. There's nothing magic, but there are some really good solid examples, and I'll send those links through to you as well at the end.
Awesome. Thanks, Deb. Peter, where do you start and how do you move a whole diocese? Oh, that's easy. Joking. Clearly, we've probably created more questions than answers, so I apologize for that. I think, again, it's about priority. If this is something at a diocesan level that needs to be a priority for whatever reason it might be, then again, time needs to be carved out for people to do that at a school level, a system level. But the investment into resources and time also needs to be seen. I think also leading this in any context, so if you're a senior leader, a middle leader, there's something that I like to come back to, and it sounds ridiculous at times, but you've just got to talk about it. It's not something that you can mention at the beginning of a year and then forget about in 5 weeks' time, maybe mention it one afternoon and then hope that it's going to happen. If anything in your school is to become a priority, you need to be talking about it all the time. You need to be talking about what your why is. Why is this a focus? What's the impact on young people? Why is it going to mean better outcomes for them? And it just needs to be front and center, because there are so many competing priorities in schools. If we give people the time and space to forget about this, then they'll be distracted and be redirected into something else. And that's not because they're doing it deliberately or they're being malicious. Schools are busy places. So it's talking about it really regularly. but it's also just change. It's change leadership, and change leadership is tough. It's about building a guiding coalition. It's about getting that guiding coalition to go and get some more people in their team on side. It's about celebrating success. I love John Cotter's work on his 8 steps of creating change. And that would be maybe a really good resource to start. There are other resources around, like DataWise from Harvard University, that talks through a cycle of change. Unashamed book plug, my book. There's a couple of steps, there's some steps in there about leading data-informed change. There's a lot of change resources out there though, and I guess I default to them because it is change leadership. It's tough going.
The other thing too, Selena, just coming back to that capability matrix as well as a basis for what are the kinds of things, you know, you might use it as an entirety, but what are the things that the evidence says are a basis for the kinds of questions you should be asking before you kind of do that deep dive into various aspects. So yes, and then you have to lead the change, but it's bringing people with you on that journey and having those conversations across a diocese. So if we want to collect evidence about what current practices across our diocese, let's bring people on board and have those conversations together, because you've got the better, with management, you've got the better chance of it happening that way.
Absolutely. And I think, again, anybody in a leadership role at any level, at the end of the day, sometimes non-negotiables can work, making it really clear. So Lynn Sharrett talks a lot about clarity, being really clear about what your expectations are around the use of data and the adjustment of practice and pedagogy based on that data. If you set some non-negotiables or co-construct some non-negotiables with your team, that can be a really good way of clarifying for people in your team what you expect of them. And then it enables you to potentially have a conversation with them down the track if they're maybe not meeting that, or if they need additional help. Sorry, Peter, second Peter question. Most valuable data sets. I think we've kind of talked about this in different ways, but I actually really see the value in NAPLAN data. I know that people have got different perspectives around it, but I think as an extra piece of information that tells us more information about our kids, I think it's quite good. I also like PAT testing, ACER testing, because of the sheer numbers of kids that have done those tests in the past. School-based results are important. But I like being able to look at school-based results in the context of standardized or norm reference tests, which is kind of why I would look at those two things together. And on the other hand, if you're looking at, say, like well-being of a school, then I mentioned it before, like attendance data, behaviour data, student well-being and bullying surveys, student perception surveys, that sort of stuff. But again, it's about identifying what your area of focus is, choosing the source of information that are going to give you really useful information about that, and then analysing and interpreting.
I think, sorry, just to come in on that too, one of the things we've been really looking at in terms of the ecosystem we're building is looking at that short cycle, mid-cycle and long-term cycle data collection and what that is and what that looks like. So Dylan William talks about it a lot. So those of you who have done some of Dylan's PD will know about that. But we've been looking at being really deliberate in the ecosystem about focusing on that short cycle. So what's the information I need about my learners in terms of what they've learned today and what I need to actually focus on or reinforce again tomorrow or the next day or this week, as opposed to that mid-cycle and then of course your longer cycle evidence collection processes as well. So that's another really effective way to look at it, I find, and we're trying to be really deliberate about that.
Yeah,
and what we're building.
And on the next slide, there's a couple of questions about formative assessment, and that's quite hard in the tracking sense. It can be quite hard because of the amount of time that it can take. And one of the things that I'm constantly hearing from schools is just, how can I give good formative feedback to kids in class that they then actually act on or can refer to later on, or how can I put it or collect it in a way that's systematic? It can be really tricky and really time consuming. And that's probably a whole other webinar, but we'll talk about that later. Roland and Ashley mentioned the wellbeing and behaviour data. We don't have time to talk about it now, but in a month's time, on the 27th of August, I'm running another webinar on wellbeing. So I'd really encourage you to come to that. We've got a couple of different people that have kind of different products and different things that they do in schools that they'll be sharing those with you. So sorry, I can't spend much time on that today. Ashley and Erin, and this kind of goes to Deb's comment as well, I think there's a lot in this question, but it is kind of about that responsiveness to any of the formative literacy or maths assessments that are done in class. Another thing I guess that's really important to point out is that the shifts that you make in practice because of what the data tells you, it doesn't have to be massive. And I think sometimes there's a misconception with people that I work with that they think, oh, there needs to be a massive change as a result of what this data tells me. It doesn't actually need to be like that. It might be that one bit of information informs a conversation that you then go and have with one student for a couple of minutes that, you know, says to them, I can see that you're finding this really tough. I'm going to spend a little bit more time with you. Just, you know, come and let me know after the lesson if you find, you know, if you're not understanding it or whatever it might be. That could be really transformational, and that's still evidence-informed practice. So don't, I guess, get sucked into this belief that it has to be, oh, well, I need to throw my program out and write a whole new one, or I need to change class groupings completely. It doesn't. It could be a really small change. It's about individual kids. It could be a really small change that you make for them. Might try and go through these kind of quickly. It's running out of time. Data walls and tracking student progress purposefully. I think one of the ways that I've seen data walls used really well is regular updating. And by regular, I mean probably twice a term. Another thing is that they should have multiple bits of information on them. So rather than say just doing, I've seen just NAPLAN data walls before, I've seen just PAT data walls. I think the strength is more so in like a literacy data wall or a numeracy data wall. That's kind of my personal opinion anyway. Deb, I'm not sure what you think about that. But it's also about one of the strategies, I guess, that I kind of work with teams on is in a short cycle of planning, starting the conversation and the meeting at the data wall and talking about the needs of the different individuals in the class, and then coming back and thinking, well, what data have I, or what evidence have I collected on their learning in that last little short cycle of planning? Can I adjust any students on the data wall, or do I need to adjust them? And what are the things that worked to help me move students on, or what could I maybe start to do to help this student that hasn't moved? But we've got to put ourselves in front of the data wall and be talking about the individuals regularly for it to have an impact. Deb, did you want to add anything on data walls?
No, not really, except it's been a really big topic for us as well. Talking about data walls, because the data visualization, people wanted to call it a digital data wall, and I was going, no. But ultimately, that probably what it is. We're looking at doing that and building that for you.
Yeah. Chantel, that's an interesting question. I think the professional learning needs would come out of one of your actions potentially. So if you looked at all the information you had in that really big filter that we were talking about earlier, and then you start to narrow down into some focus areas, when you start to identify the trends and the things that are emerging from the data, I think that would then inform what professional learning might be needed in your team or in your school. I don't know that it should be the other way around. Go into the data and have a look at what it's telling you, and then work out where the gaps are with your teachers. It might be, you know, writing strategies, it might be numeracy strategies, it might be anything, but use the data to inform it going that way. Appropriate protocols, Peter, to ensure student data is used in the correct manner. Now, this is something that a question I get a lot actually from principals and system leaders particularly. And I think one of the things that we need to be mindful of is that the world is heading towards the third generation of business intelligence, which is a data democracy. So historically, IT departments and maybe the principal held on to all of the data in a school. That kind of over time has been expanded to leadership teams, middle leaders, teachers have had more access. And we're moving into this space where we're talking about a data democracy, where people have access to the data when they want and can use it for their teaching and learning. Now, obviously, there's some highly sensitive information that wouldn't be shared, and I'm not talking about that information. But just like any other professional conduct challenge in our school, we would address the misuse of data in the same way. I think it's really important to talk about why the sharing is important and why the data democracy is important and why you see the value in teachers having access to this information regularly. But again, at the same time, putting some parameters around, well, there are really clear expectations about how this will be used and how it won't be used and where it won't be shared. And then just like any other misconduct in your school, you would deal with it in the exact same way. It would, you know, you'd start with a conversation, there'd potentially be a written warning or a formal warning depending on the severity of it. But you would follow the exact same conduct process as any other issue in your school.
It would be true though, would it, Selena, that schools are required to have a privacy policy?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for any student.
Where that will be.
Know that in the context of like a student's phone number or their address, but this is the same policy applies. Beverly, what's the key to them being successful? Look, if I had a short answer to that, I'd probably have a lot of money. I think it's leadership, it's buy-in, it's being able to lead and manage change. I think what the leadership team identify as being a priority and being important, the teachers in their school identify as a priority.
Implementation would be the other one. As I said before, you know, it would be that implementation, that we want to make this work, and being consistent and persistent. Absolutely. Gentle pressure, relentlessly applied.
Absolutely. And then James, I think we've probably mentioned that. Let's do another unashamed plug. 2 books. Start with them, maybe. No, the DataWise stuff is really good. As I've said, there's a few resources around that I can share with you. Deb had loads of ideas on her slide, or different resources that you could use. The National School Improvement Tools even got some really good ideas. The most recent Alice Springs Education Declaration talks a lot about the use of data in schools. That could be used as a starting point for the conversation. Okay, we might, it is 5 o'clock, so I might just pause there. If you'd like to ask Deb or I any questions, feel free to add them in the chat box, and I might hang around for a couple of minutes and answer any of those. If you need to duck off, then by all means do that. Oops, I pressed the wrong button. Sorry. But just so we can continue this conversation, sorry, this didn't go as well as I thought. I've lost it. There we go. Okay, so let's keep the conversation going. Feel free to ask any questions. I'll hang around. But if you'd like to, there's the really long-winded LinkedIn group name, the Network of Australian Educators Interested in Learning Analytics. Please feel free to join that. Feel free to share, contribute to the conversation. There hasn't been a lot happening there just yet, but I hope that there will be in the future. Reach out to anybody else that, if you've been chatting with anybody here, feel free to reach out to them. There's 2 upcoming webinars. So the one on the 27th of August is just about tracking student wellbeing. It's something that I've been doing a lot of during the pandemic. And we've got special guests from these little organisations in these pictures. So Connections, Champion Life, Sound Off for Schools, Resilient Youth Australia, SCODL will be joining us and sharing what they do and what their platform can do to support schools in tracking wellbeing. And then in term 4 on the 27th of October, that will be on measuring progress and achievement. And after either of them, if you can't come but you register, we'll be able to send you the recording after that. My contact details are here, as are Deb's. Feel free to reach out to us. We will send through, as I said, I'll send through a feedback link, I'll send through the PowerPoint, and we might get some of those resources from Deb as well and get them through to you. But from me, just a massive thank you for coming and for sharing and for listening this afternoon. I'm really excited about where this will head in the future, and I really look forward to continuing the conversation.
Thanks, Selena.
Thanks, Deb.